Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 11 of season 1 for Project Life Goal. We're still working on the horizontal stabilizer. I got a lot of work done since the last video. This episode's going to be quite a bit longer than the last one, so go ahead, grab your popcorn and your drink of choice, and let's take a look. Picking right up where we left off after having installed the inboard ribs, we are now doing the match drilling for all of the other ribs and spars. This is very much the same as on the vertical stabilizer, just twice as much surface area to cover. While me in the past rips through all this match drilling, I want to take this chance to talk about a few other things that have happened over the last week. For those of you that are on Facebook, I've stood up a Facebook page that is public, so anybody can see it. You don't have to join it to follow along, but if you do want to get alerts out of that, obviously you'll have to like and follow that page. That's Project Life Goal there on Facebook, so feel free to check that out. I post pictures along the way to show my progress, usually almost every time that I work on the airplane, whereas these videos are obviously delayed a little bit because of the extra work that goes into editing them. But that's also a great spot to engage with me if you don't have a YouTube account, but you do happen to have a Facebook account. So feel free to send me a message, leave a post, and I'll do my best to get back to you in a timely manner. So a couple of lessons I learned when doing this match drilling is that it's very easy to get lost. It's obviously a very repetitive operation and you are moving relatively quickly. So every time when you're going to work on a face, as I'm going to call it, just make sure you have a pattern determined of what you're going to follow in terms of your drilling order of operations. So I was doing my vertical lines, if you will, before I would do my horizontal lines. And as promised, I am making up the form to hold the vertical stabilizer. So I'm taking measurements at certain locations and then transferring those measurements over to cardboard, which will be what I use to trace that pattern out onto some plywood. What I did learn from doing this is I'd originally spec'd a 1/4 inch gap all the way around, which wasn't enough. I found after putting on the carpet, which was left over from doing the DRDT2 table, since that obviously took up a solid 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch of itself, a 1/4 inch just wasn't enough. You don't really want to hold the skins too tight. I talk about this a little bit later, but when you go to pull those ribs and spars out, they drag pretty good if it's too tight. So if I were to do this over again, I probably would increase that gap to about a 1/2 inch just to make it easier to pull the ribs and spars out without causing any scratches to the skin. Lesson learned for next time I build an airplane, and for any of you that have not started yet and plan to build forms like I did, make sure you leave yourself plenty of gap. Makes things much easier in the long run. Given the size of the completed form though, when you make it to hold the entire horizontal stabilizer, it does take up a fair bit of space. I'm not quite sure yet what I will do with this form once I finish all of the riveting for the horizontal stabilizer. My plan in terms of storage for the horizontal stabilizer was to just hang it off the wall until I was ready to attach it to the plane, which would make this form kind of no longer needed. I could break it down, but I haven't figured that out yet. Perhaps I'll actually use it to help store the horizontal stabilizer on the wall. Decisions to make when we get to that point, right? So I was measuring from both the inboard and the outboard side of the horizontal stabilizer halves. I felt that this was the best way to get a fairly accurate measurement, and for the middle rivet line, I wasn't sure about a good way to actually measure that profile of the horizontal stabilizer, so I basically held up the inboard pattern to that middle rivet line and just kind of approximated it, and then used that measurement and the same template later on, which actually worked out pretty well given the inaccuracies involved in that. For the uprights of the form, I'm just using 3/4 inch plywood, making a majority of the cuts there on the bandsaw as far as I could go with that blade, even though it's fairly shallow blade, it can't quite make those curves, so after doing the cutting operations on the bandsaw, I then had to transition to a jigsaw for the nose section of each form. And then after sanding to remove the kerf marks from the bandsaw, I moved over and started applying some strips that I cut out of that carpet. I used a staple only in the nose and then on the outside of the form. I didn't want to do staples all the way on the inside of the form and risk damaging the skin should one of those staples be proud and have it actually rub up against the skin. To actually attach the carpet there on the inside, I broke out a hot glue gun. I was trying to avoid using an adhesive that would actually harden up, so that's why I didn't use a glue of some type, and for what I had in the garage, the hot glue gun seemed to be the best. And at this point I already knew that the forms were going to be a little on the tight side from doing a test fitting, so I didn't want to use something that was going to add much more thickness, and like I say, hot glue just seemed to be the best for what I had available at the time. It worked pretty well. Obviously hot glue doesn't hold the best for carpet to wood, but it holds well enough for the amount of use that this form is going to see. So now it's time that I've got the horizontal stabilizer in the completed form for me to remove all the Clecos. Those upright members are held to the bottom piece of plywood just using some pocket holes. I didn't use any glue in case I wanted to take things apart. Okay, so looking down now that I'm taking the Clecos off, you can see there's quite a bit of flex of that skin coming out where I don't have form. The initial thought was to just do a form next to each rib line. Now I'm starting to wonder if I should have done another one in this area. We'll see if that's a problem when we actually get back to the assembly portion. But as of right now, I'm just going to keep moving on. We'll just deal with it later on with whatever happens. Alright, back to pulling Clecos. Now I always have the option to cut this form in half if I decide to separate the horizontal stabilizer in two pieces when it gets time for assembly. I haven't made that decision yet. So that wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, but it was a little stiff. I'm kind of wondering, once everything's dimpled, if getting everything back inside, all the ribs and spars, is going to be possible. Guess we'll find out. So once you pull the spars and ribs out from the skins, there's a few holes on those angles and into the 702 spars that you have to finish match drilling. I used a long drill bit here on purpose because it was my way to remind you to not forget that you have those in your toolbox, and if you don't have them, you should have them. They actually came in very handy when doing the match drilling of the inboard ribs to the forward and rear spar assemblies. So I had already marked my rib orientation before I even assembled everything, but I ended up drilling through one of the markings, so I had to redo it. So if you did it like I did, where you marked them beforehand, just make sure you double check those in case you drilled through them. And that's a great reminder to mention that I did mark most of my components ahead of time, well before Vans actually tells you to do so. Mostly because I was going at the approach of doing it as one assembly and not a left and a right assembly. I still recommend, regardless of the approach that you take, mark things as soon as you start using them. It just helps visualize the materials from the plans on paper to the actual pieces that you have in front of you. So I had cut 702 here using a pair of handheld snips. It left a pretty rough edge that I'm having to touch up with a hand file. A little too aggressive for the Scotch-Brite wheel. And moving on to deburring. Definitely spent a lot of time on this. This was a majority of how I spent my weekend deburring all of the ribs and spars and skins. I used a wide combination of tools as I continue to develop my technique that works for me. I found that while the little miniature Scotch-Brite on the rotary tool does help a lot for very tight, confined spaces, They don't last very long given their size, and they are not very aggressive for whatever reason. It's probably just the particular Scotch-Brite wheel that I got that I'm sacrificed and I'm using for that purpose. So I found doing a bulk of the work with hand files for those tight spaces saved a lot of time. Then I just used the rotary tool to kind of polish off those filing marks. So while we go through all of this deburring footage, a couple other things. I did add some featured channels to my YouTube pages. These are channels that I watch on a very regular basis. I'm subscribed to, get alerts on. So feel free to check those out if you're somewhat new to the aviation community on YouTube and you want to find some other good channels. A couple of them are also fellow RV builders that I think are doing a very good job on YouTube, but there are certainly a lot more other channels out there than the ones that I have featured. Also, one of the questions that I get a lot, so I figured I'd just answer it here as well for everyone, is how long is this project going to take? That's probably one of the first questions that I ever get asked. I'm using an estimate that seems to be accurate for most builders out there of an RV-7 of around 2,000 hours. So given my personal life commitments, I'm guessing that I can invest about 400 hours per year, which will make this approximately a 5-year project for me. What that comes out to in terms of how I've broken it out is roughly 8 hours a week for a majority of the year. I try to do 1 hour a night during the week for 4 nights, and then I have a night off, and then on the weekend I try to put in 4 hours. So far that seems to be working out really well for me in my schedule, which has allowed me to make the progress that I have. So much that I've actually gotten to the point where I had to seriously consider ordering the wing kits, since there is currently an 8 to 10 week lead time on it. So I've actually already gone ahead and done that. So the wing kit should be here another 2.5 months. So super excited about that. But it definitely gives me a deadline. I need to get through the empennage section fairly quickly. But I don't think it will be a problem as long as that rivet gun finally shows up. So the hand files that I'm using during these deburring operations are actually chainsaw files. They were spare files I hadn't used on a chainsaw that I had lying around. And I think that's actually been one of the most interesting parts of building an airplane, is there's so many tools that you will probably already have that aren't aviation specific. They're not specialty tools, but they're required to build the airplane. So if you're concerned about all the tools that you have to buy, also remember you probably already have a fair bit of tools that you can use sitting in your garage. I mean, if you're considering building an airplane, you're probably already somewhat handy yourself, and have collected a fair bit of tools like I have over the years. A good example is, in terms of everyday items that were not aviation specific, the only ones that I really bought was the bench grinder, that small bench top bandsaw, and then this bench top drill press. That's really about it. Everything else I already had, so I only had to purchase the aviation specific tools. And now I'm starting to move on to the spar doublers, the HS1 parts. I saved these till last. Why, I don't know, but that was just what I did. So I'm almost done here with deburring of edges on all of the spars and ribs. I'm just finishing up the doublers and then the angles. It's very much the same operation as from the vertical stabilizer, just some slightly different parts and a lot more of them. None of it was terribly complex. It obviously just took time. So let's go ahead and fast forward to the end of the edge deburring.
That's a lot of deburring.
Yes, it was a lot of deburring, but there's still more to go. So after doing all of the straight edges of the spars and the ribs and the corner reliefs, things of that nature, I moved over to doing all of the holes. I've really been enjoying the EZ-Burr deburring tool. I think a lot as I watch through these videos and see me using that, particularly on the spars and the ribs when I'm doing the holes in the flanges. It just saves a lot of time. That's clear to me. I don't think I'd ever want to go back to not using that tool. It's always kind of a little bit of a dreadful moment for me when I have to put it down and grab the rotodrive tool or some other tool to do a hole deburring operation. But as I said in a previous video, they do come with their own quirks. I did have to adjust them a couple of times during the video. Part of that's obviously because I'm still new to this and getting used to them and learning the capabilities and the technique. But definitely, just if you do buy one and you do decide to use one, make sure that you spend the time adjusting them here and there as you develop your own technique and it continues to evolve, so that you're always getting the best deburr of those holes as possible. In deburring of these spars, it was pretty uneventful. I just kind of powered through all of them, so I apologize I didn't get a lot of close-up shots of the action, but I was in let's get it done mode. Was definitely motivated. The one problem that I did notice while I was going through this is, since I am priming all of my components, I'm not sure how I'm going to safely scuff up all of the surfaces without destroying all of my orientation marks, and that's why you see all of the blue painter's tape all over these pieces. They're covering up marks. Because halfway through the hole deburring, I did actually stop and I did a little of scuffing of the parts just to kind of break up the monotony of deburring. And that's when I kind of realized the problem that I was facing. So if you've got any great tips for that, of how to save your orientation marks, probably what I'll do at this point is simply just scratch up everything outside of those painting marks, or orientation marks rather, pull off that painter's tape one at a time, scuff that section up, and then put the mark right back on. I think that's probably the best way. But if you've got another way that you think would work, go ahead, drop a comment below and let me know. I'd appreciate it.
That's a lot of deburring of holes, but there's still more to go.
And onto the skins I move, taking off the blue protective film. Still not a huge fan of that process. I know it's a common complaint for a lot of builders. I don't have any good tips. I've seen a couple of different approaches that everyone takes. I'm not sure if any of it really saves time, to be honest. If you've got a tip that you think works out real well, let me know.
So, a moment of confession. I forgot to label my skins. And if it wasn't for having this jig that I created that had both skins held in it and taking photos and catching the mistake when I did, I might have not been able to get the labels in the correct spot. So make sure you label yours before you take your spars out and lose your orientation references.
Yes, a fault of my memory from having labeled everything except the skins so early on. I was just so excited to try out that form and pull the spars and ribs out, it kind of slipped my mind. So just take your time. I got fortunate having enough photos, and the fact that the plywood had different colorings and markings on it allowed me to figure out where the skins actually belonged, what orientation they were in. So it ended up being okay, but it could have been a disaster. I don't even want to think about having to start over from scratch with 2 new skins. Yeah, let's just not even consider that, because it didn't happen. So again, very much the same as doing the deburring of the holes on the vertical stabilizer, just a lot more of them. And just as with doing your match drilling, obviously develop a pattern and follow it. That will make it easier to not lose track of where you're at and not skip any holes. So I'm going to go even faster through the remainder of the deburring of the holes on the skin, and we'll move right into the dimpling excuse me, of the spars and the ribs. I elected to use the squeezer wherever I could for this, and it was something is just extremely satisfying about using that squeezer to do the dimpling operations. I look forward to getting to use it again to do some riveting here shortly after I finish priming all of the components. Really not a huge amount of gotchas other than the top side of the skin does have a few other fairing attach points, just like the vertical stabilizer, which is why you see some of those holes marked off with painter's tape, so I don't accidentally dimple them again, as I did previously on the vertical stabilizer. So I definitely learned my lesson there. Just pay close attention to those plans. I know I looked at them much more closely this time, so I wouldn't make another silly mistake as I did previously. The dimpling with a squeezer goes really quick. Once you get it dialed in to where it needs to be, it's almost a set and forget operation. I still try to take a look at every few dimples, make sure they're still coming out right. I have noticed, at least for me, there does seem to be some amount of technique that is required, even though it is a mechanized operation. So I try to always keep the faces of the dimple dies as parallel to the flange face as possible. That seems to give me the best result. And now moving on to the dimpling of the skins. Also another very rewarding operation, though I did find it challenging at times to balance the skins carefully, because obviously you don't want to damage them, you don't want to drop them, or put a dimple in the wrong spot just because you're off slightly. I did catch myself a couple of times where between when I had first aligned up the dimple dies and when I went to actually engage them with the skin, it had moved slightly. So I definitely slowed down a lot this time versus the vertical stabilizer, and I think the results show I think it looks much better this time around. And it's rinse and repeat for the dimpling. Two sides to each skin, 2 skins to do. So with that, I'm going to use some of this time here. If you guys got questions, you got comments, I encourage you to leave them below in the comment section. It actually really does help me out a lot to know what you guys are interested in, what you want to hear about. And then also for these voiceovers, I try to stay engaged with you guys as much as possible, and sometimes it's difficult to come up with a conversation or a topic to discuss, mostly because I don't want to repeat myself too much for you. I mean, once you've seen one dimpling operation, you've kind of seen them all, but I'm trying to include all of the footage to show that I've done the work just for records purposes. So again, if you've got something that you want to talk about, go ahead, leave a comment for me below. Let's go ahead and fast forward to the edge dimpling, and we'll start wrapping this up. I did elect to use the hand squeezer again to do the edge dimpling. Mostly just because it's a fair bit of holes, and at some point, if I were to do this with a hand squeezer, fatigue would inevitably set in. I don't do this every day, so I don't have the muscle memory or the endurance built up, if you will, for that particular operation, since it is extremely repetitive. And obviously, fatigue leads to mistakes. But here I reached the point where I did come across the fairing attach holes. I had kept that in the back of my mind the entire time I was doing the edge dimpling, and I marked them once I got to those edges. They're only done on the top side, and it's one dimple gets skipped, and then you have 3 dimples. 1 dimple gets skipped is the pattern that they seem to be using, which was different than the pattern that they used on the vertical stabilizer. So make sure you pay close attention to that. And with that, guys, I think it's time to wrap up this video. I had a lot of fun working on the horizontal stabilizer. A lot of work happened this past week. Where we're at right now in terms of time is I have 36 hours of actual build time on the project now, which brings the total project time up to 46 hours, and then another 21 hours of video editing. If you guys enjoyed this much longer video, let me know, and I'll try to do more this way. If you're enjoying the interjections of my commentary as a single moment in time while I was actually doing the work, I'll keep doing that for you as well. So leave a comment below. Hit the like button if you did enjoy this video. It really does help me out. Subscribe if you're not already. Click that alert button to follow along and get messages every time I post a video. And I will see you guys next time. Take care.